Once you've had a revolution, what do you do with it? And what does it feel like to be inside it? In 1992, Moscow flea markets overflowed with answers to these questions. A year after the Soviet Union collapsed, people sold whatever they could find in their apartments. Ration cards, war medals, old perfumes. These objects showed what Soviet life was actually like, how it fed itself, who prospered, even what an ordinary Tuesday afternoon felt like. For almost 50 years, those afternoons unfolded behind the Iron Curtain. There, daily life took specific shapes. Hours waiting for bread and years for an apartment, yes, but also subsidized ballet tickets everyone could afford, and Black Sea vacations that factory workers took every summer. Tonight, we explore what 70 years of communism look like from the inside. We'll follow the traces left by hundreds of millions of people who lived inside a system that reinvented what it meant to be human. We'll see how they ate, worked, and loved, while history itself was being rewritten around them. By the end, you'll understand a way of life that shaped half the world. This is the story of everyday life in the USSR. Chapter 1. The Great Soviet Sell-Off. Moscow, 1992. Izmailovsky Park on a Saturday morning. The frost hadn't lifted yet, your breath hanging in the air between makeshift stalls. This flea market was the Great Soviet Sell-Off, where an entire civilization was being dismantled. One transaction at a time, its relics spread out on folding tables and tarps on the frozen ground. The people doing the selling were a unique breed of human, Homo Sovieticus. Their state had been their entire cosmos, blocking out everything else. They were a people built for war and sacrifice, for a collective we that gave their lives meaning. They understood a lexicon of words like liquidate and execute, but they had no words for profit margins, no understanding of the market that had suddenly become their reality. Overnight, their world had been covered in banks and billboards. The signs that once promised, "Our future is communism," now screamed, "Buy now!" Freedom, it turned out, was not an ideal. It was consumption. It was money. And so they stood here in the cold, selling the pieces of their former lives, utterly bewildered. No one had taught them how to be free. They had only ever been taught how to die for freedom. In a cardboard box, you could find the nation's soul, a mountain of red flags and party membership cards, and the war medals, an Order of Lenin, the highest honor, for $100, a medal for valor for 20. When someone asked the seller about his conscience, he just shrugged from inside his thin coat. "Are you nuts? What rock have you been living under? These are relics from the era of totalitarianism." A former professor stood shivering behind his life's collection of books, a former ballet dancer selling her costumes from the Kirov. Two soldiers with a crate of gas masks, manufacture date 1981. By noon, the market covered several acres. Someone had set up a gramophone and was playing old Red Army choir recordings. The music drifted over the stalls, tinny and strange in the winter air. What does it mean when a civilization's most sacred objects end up spread on tarps in a muddy field? When a hero of socialist labor medal sits in a cardboard box next to broken watches and mismatched spoons? The sellers knew, the buyers knew, everyone knew, but nobody said it out loud. This was the real end. Not the flag coming down from the Kremlin on December 25th, but this, 1,000 small surrenders. All of it for sale, all of it negotiable, all of it turning into rent money or bread money or money for a train ticket to somewhere else. The sun never really came out that day. The market kept going until dark. Tomorrow there would be more sellers, more objects. Someone had dragged an old industrial sewing machine to sell its metal plate stamped with Cyrillic letters and a serial number, made in Magnitogorsk, 1952. The seller didn't know that city had once been Stalin's greatest construction site, built from nothing in the frozen steppe. The machine was just another heavy thing to haul home if nobody bought it by closing time. Chapter 2. Forging Magnitogorsk. 1,200 kilometers east of Moscow, where the Ural steppe stretches toward Asia, there's a city that shouldn't exist, Magnitogorsk. Before 1929, this was empty grassland where nomads grazed their horses. The wind blew uninterrupted for thousands of kilometers. Then Stalin decided to build his Pittsburgh here, in the middle of nowhere. The decree came on January 17th, 1929. Build the world's largest steel complex. Make more steel than Britain. Do it in 5 years. But this was more than a construction project. The entire decade was declared a heroic age. The official songs boasted about taming space and time, about becoming the young masters of the earth. The immense hardship of the present was an acceptable sacrifice for a guaranteed, radiant future. Everyone was building socialism, a new world forged from steel and will. The first 256 workers arrived that March, stepping off the train into a wilderness. Soon, they were joined by thousands of others. Many were young Komsomol members, the communist youth, arriving with a powerful sense of mission. They saw themselves as fighters, pioneers declaring war on Russia's ancient backwardness. One young activist felt the entire country's transformation depended on the physical exertions of people like himself. They believed they were personally building a new civilization. Others came for different reasons. For millions of peasants fleeing the famine and chaos of collectivization, Magnitogorsk was an escape route. In the cities, you could get a job, a wage, and a ration card. You could learn a trade. More than 10 million peasants moved to towns during the first 5-year plan alone. For them, the city meant a chance at education, a burning desire to study. By summer 1931, 40,000 people were living there. The steppes had to be beaten down, the official newspapers said. Nature itself was the enemy. What the new arrivals found was chaos. John Scott, an American welder who came to help build socialism, recorded the scene. Imported American machinery sat rusting because nobody knew how to operate it. Workers mixed concrete by hand. The workforce was everyone Stalin's revolution had churned up. Enthusiastic volunteers worked alongside deported kulaks. Common criminals shared barracks with political prisoners. 40 different nationalities were thrown together. You could hear Russian, Tatar, Kazakh, and Ukrainian at the work site. Work orders often got lost in translation. Yet, something extraordinary happened in this chaos. An illiterate Tatar woman learned to operate a blast furnace. A peasant's son became a red director running the entire complex. This was the promise fulfilled. The 1930s were an age of opportunity for ambitious people from the right background. The government actively promoted workers and peasants into higher education, creating a new elite of engineers and managers. They felt they were the young masters, and they thanked the revolution for the chance. Life found a way. Workers planted potatoes in the dirt between construction sites. Informal settlements sprang up, nicknamed Shanghai for their ramshackle appearance. In the evenings, someone might play a harmonica in the barracks, the sound thin against the vastness of the steppe. On Sundays, there were football matches on packed earth. People fell in love, got married, had children, all in the shadow of the blast furnaces that never stopped burning day or night. The steel from Magnitogorsk financed everything else Stalin wanted to build. It paid for the Moscow metro, the Dnieper Dam, the White Sea Canal. Today, Magnitogorsk still stands, still produces steel. The air tastes of sulfur and metal. The snow falls gray from the factory smoke. The city that shouldn't exist remains a monument to a particular kind of human will. The pyramids of Egypt took decades. Magnitogorsk took 5 years. Both were built with a mix of raw belief and brutal force, meant to last forever. And while the furnaces burned, turning ore into metal, the Soviet state was crafting a new kind of product, forged in the same fire of ideology. Chapter 3: Designing the Dream. From 1930 to 1941, the Soviet Union published the most beautiful magazine ever created, USSR in Construction. Came out monthly in Russian, English, German, and French. Thick paper, gorgeous photography, innovative design. It was a vision of a future you could hold in your hands, a tactile piece of the coming paradise. Foreign intellectuals collected these magazines, displayed them in their studies as proof that something wonderful was happening in the East. The photographer Alexander Rodchenko helped shape its visual language. He believed you could revolutionize human consciousness by revolutionizing how people see, photograph ordinary objects from unexpected angles. Make the familiar strange. Force the eye to work differently. A smokestack shot from directly below becomes a geometric abstraction. Workers on scaffolding turn into diagonal lines cutting across the sky. "We must discover the visible world," he said. "We must revolutionize our visual thinking." This new way of seeing had a name: socialist realism. The magazine taught its readers to see life not as it was, but as it was becoming. An empty, muddy ditch was a future canal. A vacant lot filled with rubbish was a future park. The magazine pioneered cinematic photo essays where images flowed into each other, creating movement on the static page. Here is a wooden plough from 1860. Turn the page. A field of tractors stretching to the horizon. The message was simple. The past is primitive. The future has already arrived. You just have to learn how to see it. This was an aspirational reality, a promise that made the grim present feel temporary. People learned to live in a state of becoming. The memoirist Raisa Orlova recalled that her grim communal apartment was just a preparation. Life, properly speaking, would begin later in a new and sparkling white house. The feeling was faster, faster toward the great goal, and there everything would begin in a genuine sense. The magazine was the blueprint for that sparkling house, the map to that great goal. The visual language drew from Otto Neurath's Vienna method of pictorial statistics. Neurath had visited Moscow, advised the Soviet Isostat Institute. His idea was that pictures could convey complex information to illiterate populations. The Soviets took this further. They made statistics emotional. A graph of rising wheat production became a golden wave sweeping across the page. Coal output statistics transformed into mountains of black diamonds. Artists like El Lisitsky designed entire issues. His work on the Dnieper hydroelectric station used photomontage to make the dam into abstract art and the workers into heroic silhouettes. And many people, especially the young, genuinely believed they were those heroes. The generation of the 1930s saw themselves as participants in a historic process. They eagerly went off as pioneers to distant construction sites like Magnitogorsk, building a steel city on the empty steppe because they believed they were building a new world. This heroic tension, an activist from the era recalled, was an excuse for all the difficulties. But how did they reconcile these glossy images with the shortages, the fear, and the drabness of daily life? They lived a double life. In the privacy of their kitchens at night, they criticized the government and told bitter jokes. In the morning, they walked out the door and transformed into average Soviet citizens, slaving away for the regime. It was a necessary performance. They also held on to the promise that their hardship was a noble sacrifice. We believed that tomorrow would be better than today, one witness recalled. We had a future. The magazine stopped publishing when Germany invaded in 1941. The printing presses that had produced those gorgeous photo essays were retooled to print ration cards. The photographers who'd shot carefully composed images of Soviet paradise were now documenting mass graves. Yet the vision they had crafted did its work. It convinced millions, both at home and abroad, that the experiment was succeeding. Even now, in museums and private collections, those magazines still seduce. They are the beautiful ghosts of a future that only partially existed, a dream whose full, shocking cost would only be tallied when the archives were finally opened decades later. Chapter 4. The Kommunalka. During the industrialization drive of the 1930s, more than 10 million peasants flooded into Soviet cities. The housing crisis was catastrophic. The state had one solution: the Kommunalka, the communal apartment. Take a pre-revolutionary apartment built for one wealthy family, divided between 8 households, 1 room per family. Everyone shares the kitchen and bathroom. By 1960, more than half of Moscow lived this way. 25 million families across the USSR. Ilya Kabakov mapped how these spaces changed after the revolution. His building once had sitting rooms, studies, servants' quarters, nurseries with painted walls. After 1917, the state put up partitions, thin walls that didn't reach the ceiling. The former library housed the Petrovs and their 2 children. The old master bedroom held a war widow and her mother. The kitchen was the main battlefield. 8 families, 8 tiny tables, each one defended with absolute determination. Touch someone else's salt shaker and you'd hear about it for months. Private property was jealously guarded. Pots, pans, even personal toilet seats that hung on hooks in the bathroom. You'd carry yours in, use it, carry it back out. Some families had padded seats. Others used bare wood, worn smooth since 1928. The ethnologist Ilya Utekin studied how people navigated this world. They weren't just passive victims enduring stress. They were active agents, using whatever tools they had. The most precious commodity was square meters of living space. Resentment over space could spark feuds that lasted decades, not just shouting matches, lawsuits, denunciations to local authorities. Report your neighbor for an anti-Soviet joke. Maybe get their room. During the purges of 1937, this system turned lethal. A hostile neighbor could destroy you. They'd file complaints that could get you disfranchised, refused a passport, arrested. Even in calmer times, any argument about noise or cooking smells might escalate to someone calling the building committee. The Kommunalka was a functioning social system, brutal but complex. Yet it wasn't all warfare. Apartments also often functioned as networks of mutual support. Neighbors who nursed each other through illness, watched each other's children. Residents often left their doors unlocked, helped each other out. When the wife of an enemy of the people needed shelter, sometimes neighbors looked the other way. Children often had different memories. They found playmates in the corridors. The Kommunalka was their social laboratory. They could observe 8 different varieties of adult behavior before breakfast. Less developed instincts for private property meant they saw opportunity where adults saw invasion. For them, the endless drama could be entertainment. Joseph Brodsky remembered the sensory overload mornings, when everyone needed the stove at once. Metal on metal, water boiling, oil spitting, the smells that told you everything about your neighbors' lives. Cabbage soup on Monday, fish on Friday, the Armenian family's coffee that made everyone else jealous. The corridors had their own weather. In winter, you could see your breath in the hallway. In summer, the smell of 8 families' sweat and cooking fat hung in the air. People developed ways to move through these spaces without touching, without making eye contact. A domestic choreography born from too many people in too little space. Kabakov called it a daily domestic penal colony, but that misses something essential. Yes, there were wars over who bought toilet paper last. Someone used too much hot water. Someone's guest stayed too long in the bathroom. But this was also a machine for producing a particular kind of person. Someone who could endure anything. Someone who could carve out a life in impossible circumstances. By 1989, a quarter of Leningrad still lived this way. Millions who'd grown up with 7 other families knowing their every secret. The Kommunalka was Soviet society in miniature. All its conflicts, accommodations, and survival strategies compressed into a few shared rooms. And if the Kommunalka taught patience through forced intimacy, the Soviet queue taught it through endless waiting, where entire days could disappear into the simple act of waiting for bread. Chapter 5. The Queue. From the early 1930s, life revolved around an endless, grinding struggle for the basics. Chronic shortages of food, clothing, and soap were a central fact of existence. The state's answer to this was the queue. The historian Yelena Osokina wrote that the Soviet line made history right alongside the Soviet social order. It was everywhere, a permanent feature of the landscape, etched onto the cities like a scar. The experience was often desperate. During the worst shortages, like the winter of 1936, people waited in line for bread from 2 in the morning. Thousands of peasants slept on the frozen ground outside bakeries. Letters to newspapers described the noise, the shouting, the fights, the curses aimed at Soviet power. One report told of people freezing to death on the journey home, the bread they had waited all night for clutched in their hands. This line was a distinct social space, with its own culture and its own unwritten laws. It even had a specific vocabulary. You never asked, "What are they selling?" You asked, "What are they giving out?" This acknowledged the reality of state distribution. Goods that were hard to get were known by a single term: deficit goods. The first rule, understood by everyone, was to join any line you saw immediately. Only after you had secured your place did you ask what it was for. Shopping became a survival skill. A new species emerged, Homo Sovieticus, whose most developed talents involved the hunting and gathering of scarce goods in an urban environment. This required constant vigilance and the right tools. Every citizen carried a string bag and a voska tucked away in a pocket. The name meant just in case. You had to be ready for the off chance you stumbled upon something worth having. The queue was also a hub of information. It was the nation's unofficial public square. With hundreds of frustrated people forced together for hours, they started talking. They exchanged rumors. They shared news. They complained. The secret police knew this was dangerous. They planted informers in the longest queues to record the conversations, listening for any curses directed at the state or its leader. The queue was where official promises were measured against the harsh reality of an empty bag. There was, however, one strategy that trumped all others. The most important survival skill was knowing how to avoid the queue altogether. An entire alternative system existed, a world of personal connections and reciprocal favors known as Blatt. The public's access to goods was so unreliable that a whole vocabulary emerged to describe getting things on the left or under the counter. A popular proverb captured the entire philosophy. One must have not 100 rubles, but 100 friends. Blatt was a network of relationships, a system of favors among equals that participants saw as simple friendship. Having a connection with a store manager or a warehouse worker was more valuable than a wallet full of cash. These contacts could give you advance warning when a shipment of deficit goods was due. They might let you in through the back door. The satirical journal Crocodile once ran a cartoon of a store manager who only sold to customers he knew by name. The caption read, "If he doesn't know someone, he doesn't sell to them." For those without the right friends, there was only the line. The average Soviet woman spent 2 hours a day queuing. That adds up to 9 full working weeks a year, just standing, waiting, hoping something would be left when you finally reached the counter. It was time made visible, a lifetime spent in anticipation. And while millions stood waiting for the basics, the state was designing grand, monumental spaces where this national patience could be transformed into public spectacle. Chapter 6. A Garden for the New Human Being. In 1935, a new slogan appeared from Stalin. Life has become better, comrades. Life has become more cheerful. This marked a major shift, a turn away from the asceticism of the early revolution. Historians call it the Great Retreat. The state began to foster a new tolerance for people enjoying themselves, actively encouraging mass leisure activities like carnivals, dancing, and even jazz. The prototype for this new vision was a park built on the site of Moscow's old municipal dump, Gorky Park. Its purpose was to offer a new kind of cultured leisure to the masses. It was an education in Kulturnost. In the 1930s, culture was seen as something that had to be mastered. It was the complex of behaviors, attitudes, and knowledge that separated cultured people from those considered backward. Its value was self-evident, and for millions, the desire for it was immense. This hunger for self-improvement was real. One woman of peasant background remembered arriving in Moscow with a burning desire to study, saying, "Where or what wasn't important. I wanted to study." A popular saying put it more bluntly, "Without that piece of paper, the diploma, you are an insect. With it, a human being." In a 1937 survey, nearly half the young workers at the Stalin auto plant said their main goal was to continue their education. Kulturnost had levels. The most basic was hygiene, washing with soap, cleaning your teeth, not spitting on the floor. The next step was mastering urban behavior, using a knife and fork, sleeping on sheets, wearing underwear, and not getting so drunk you missed work. For the new elite, it meant correct speech and an appreciation for ballet. The magazine Ogonek ran a quiz, "Are you a cultured person?" Readers were expected to know 5 plays by Shakespeare, 5 makes of Soviet automobile, 4 rivers in Africa, and the names of 7 Stakhanovites. Gorky Park was the laboratory where all this was taught. It was a mix of education and entertainment. It had Ferris wheels, bowling alleys, dance floors, and cinemas. It even had recreational parachute jumping towers. At the opening of the winter season in 1935, Stalin's "Life has become more cheerful" slogan was draped in a banner over the main gates. A carnival of happy youth that same year saw 3,000 young people parade through the grounds. The American ambassador, Joseph Davis, saw a sports parade there in July 1937. He described 50,000 young people, tanned and beautiful, in a 4-hour procession. There were gymnasts performing on moving floats, acrobats doing somersaults, and 1,500 young men skiing over the asphalt on skis fitted with ball bearings. He called it one of the most beautiful and extraordinary exhibitions he had ever seen. This was July 1937, the height of the Great Terror. While Davies watched teenagers doing backflips, the secret police were conducting mass arrests across the city. The park created its own reality, a performance of socialist joy, just a few kilometers from the torture chambers of the Lubyanka prison. It was a space where the state's vision of happiness met the people's genuine need for rest and self-improvement. Both were happening at once, in the shadow of unimaginable darkness. But this public world of organized leisure had its counterpart in the intensely private world of the home. Chapter 7: Education and Upward Mobility. Across the Soviet Union in the 1930s, a social earthquake was underway. At every level, in every corner of the vast country, people were changing their status. Peasants were leaving the village for the first time, moving to town and becoming industrial workers. Workers were moving off the factory floor into technical jobs or becoming party officials. The change was so common, so expected, that the standard trade union personnel questionnaire included a line for it: year of moving out of production or quitting agriculture. It was simply assumed that you had. This immense churn was the result of a deliberate state project, A rapidly expanding economy created a desperate need for new jobs, for managers, engineers, and party secretaries. The government responded with a policy of aggressive affirmative action called Vidvizheny. Stalin himself initiated a major program for sending promising workers, young communists, and peasants to higher education. He was building a new society and needed a new ruling class, loyal to the system that had created them from scratch. For millions, the key that unlocked this new world was education. A burning desire to study became a defining feature of the generation. One woman, born to a peasant family, recalled the feeling vividly. Where or what wasn't important. I wanted to study, she said, understanding that learning was the ticket to a different life. A popular saying captured this belief with brutal clarity. Without that piece of paper, you are an insect. With it, a human being. At the Stalin auto plant in 1937, a survey of young workers found that nearly half of them stated that continuing my education was their main personal goal. The state constructed an entire new infrastructure to meet this demand. It was a multi-track system for advancement. There were special networks of party schools and preparatory schools known as Rabfak, designed to bring workers up to academic speed. Industrial academies, like the one attended by a young Nikita Khrushchev, were created to turn miners into managers. The expansion of the formal education system was explosive. In the single decade after 1928, the number of children in school almost tripled, while the number in secondary schools ballooned by 6 times. This project produced countless real-life success stories, Cinderella-like ascents from the humblest position to the heights. Georgy Alexandrov, the son of a worker, was a homeless child before being taken into an orphanage. He was trained as a metal worker, kept studying, and eventually became a professor and head of propaganda for the Central Committee. Sergei Kaftanov worked in a mine as a teenager and made his way through the Komsomol and a trade school to the Mendeleev Chemical Institute, later becoming first deputy minister for culture. Roman Belan and Viktor Lvov, the sons of a poor peasant and a cooper, rose to become the directors of the massive industrial plants at Zaporozhye Steel and the Putilov Works. This entire cohort formed the core of the Soviet leadership for decades to come. They were the Brezhnev generation. Leonid Brezhnev and most of his long-serving Politburo in the 1970s and 1980s were beneficiaries of this vast affirmative action project. They were, and they felt themselves to be, the young masters of the Soviet Union. They were profoundly grateful to Stalin and the revolution for the chances they had been given. The experience created a deep psychological bond between those who were promoted and the system that promoted them. They felt an immense pride in their journey. The memoir of Evgenia Fedorovna, a milliner who became a factory's technical director, is a classic example. She celebrated her own long road from the illiterate Jenka to a cultured Soviet woman. This was more than a career. It was a fundamental transformation of the self. They saw their success in ideological terms as a collective victory. The famous tractor driver Pasha Angelina explained this perfectly. Contrasting her own story with that of a Western press baron, she wrote that while the Westerner rose from the people, I rose together with the people. This conviction that their individual success was just one part of a shared historic ascent was a crucial element of their identity and their unwavering loyalty. The memory of this time, when a path was open for the little man, lingered for many years. An interviewee in the 1990s recalled the Soviet street names with a specific pride: Metallurgists Avenue, Enthusiasts Avenue, Factory Street. The little man was the most important one around. Another voice, full of loss, looked back on that era. Under socialism, she said, I was promised that there was a place in the sun for everyone. Chapter 8: The Wives' Movement. In the new industrial towns of the 1930s, life for the wives of the Soviet elite could be a vacuum. Their husbands were building a new world, absorbed completely by the factory, the plan, the endless meetings. The women were often left behind in new settlements that were little more than construction sites in the middle of nowhere. There were few amenities. One wife wrote of the sheer emptiness of her days, where the only events were a trip to the hairdresser or another party with the same guests, and nothing new to discuss. It was a profound isolation, a social and intellectual gulf that separated them not just from the new Soviet society, but from their own husbands. An engineer's wife, raised in the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia, remembered the alienation keenly. The more time her husband spent at the plant, the greater the distance between them grew. He had new acquaintances, new industrial administrators and party workers. She found it was not enough simply to make conversation. One had to know what to talk about. In a society that sanctified labor, being just a housewife was a source of shame. These women were officially classified as part of the unorganized population. One complained that she felt they were not even considered fully human. The label was a constant, irritating reminder of their peripheral status. Then, a movement appeared that felt like a godsend. It was called the Общественница movement, named after its journal, which meant woman activist. It originated in heavy industry, under the direct patronage of Sergo Orjonikidze, the powerful minister of heavy industry. The official launch came in May 1936, at a grand conference in the Kremlin for the wives of managers and engineers, attended by Stalin himself. The movement offered these women a way to connect, a purpose, a bridge into the new society that had seemed to exclude them. The founding myth was simple and effective. Orjonikidze, on a tour of a plant, was said to have been inspired by a public square that had been single-handedly beautified by Klavdia Surovtseva, a manager's wife who had filled it with flowers and bushes. This story captured the movement's spirit. Its great discovery was its organizing principle. Women were organized not by their neighborhood, but through their husband's workplace. This structure inherently mirrored the industrial hierarchy. At any local branch, the enterprise director's wife was usually the one who took the lead. This was explicitly a form of organization for elite wives, not for ordinary working women. Even when the wives of high-performing Stakhanovite workers were later included, it did little to change the movement's upper-class character or how it was perceived. This could create friction. At one factory, workers complained that the manager's wives were only interested in getting themselves honors and publicity. They accused them of exploiting workers to create elaborate gifts for political leaders. The movement was a solution for some, but a source of resentment for others. The core mission of the wives was to bring kulturnost, a sense of cultured living, to their raw, new communities. They embarked on a vast range of civic improvement projects. They planted tens of thousands of trees and flower beds. The wives of commanders of the Amur River Fleet reportedly dug 68,000 flower beds and planted 70,000 trees. They sewed countless table napkins, rugs, curtains, and lampshades to adorn the stark red army barracks, trying to turn sterile spaces into something resembling a home. They took on the grim task of improving workers' housing, furnishing dreary dormitories and barracks. They organized essential services, setting up kindergartens, nurseries, and holiday camps for children. They established literacy schools, libraries, and public baths. They even began supervising the quality of food served in factory cafeterias, extending their domestic concerns into the public sphere. Alongside these community projects, they also worked to improve their own lives. In the industrial city of Magnitogorsk, the wives set up a cultured cafe in the local theater. At other plants, they established fashion ateliers, some catering exclusively to elite women, with dresses costing as much as 100 rubles. Initially, the movement's ideology centered on domesticity. The main theme was the wife's obligation to create a comfortable, well-ordered home life for her important, hard-working husband. The ideal was a professor's wife who, despite her own volunteer work, always ensured her husband returned to a welcoming home of exemplary order and warm, feminine comfort. But this ideal was not accepted by everyone. The journal Obskestvenitsa published a letter from an engineer's wife who felt she was wasting her education, being left out of all the exciting things happening in the country. The letter sparked a fierce debate. Some readers responded with sharp criticism for her husband, comparing him to an old country nobleman who needed a serf to scratch his heels before he could sleep. As the 1930s wore on and the threat of war loomed, the focus of the movement began to shift. Women were encouraged to learn traditionally male skills. They learned to shoot, drive a truck, and fly planes. The journal began to frame the movement as a preparatory stage, a stepping stone for wives who were bound for further education or promotion into administrative work. The ultimate symbol of this transformation was the movement's founder, Klavdia Surovtseva. After gaining prominence through her activism, she made a decisive break. She left her husband, moved to Moscow, and enrolled in the prestigious Stalin Industrial Academy. There, she remarried a fellow student. She declared that her college transcript was her new passport. It was her passport to a new life. Chapter 9. the Soviet body. The French writer André Gide stood on the Mausoleum Tribune in 1936, watching the annual Fiskultura parade. He later confessed, "I had never imagined so magnificent a sight. These perfect forms had evidently been trained, prepared, selected. But how can one fail to admire a country and a regime capable of producing them?" Every year on Red Square, tens of thousands of Soviet bodies moved in perfect synchronization. The American ambassador Joseph Davis watched the 1937 parade and could barely contain his amazement. It was flaming youth, and a very beautiful youth it was, all bareheaded and tanned to a deep brown, for the most part wearing only white shorts and colored jerseys. The combinations of blues and whites, reds and whites, oranges and whites made a beautiful display. There were skiers actually skiing in companies of 1,500 young men. They apparently had ball bearings on their skis to enable them to get over the asphalt. On some floats were the horizontal bars with the gymnasts actually performing, and springboards with acrobats doing double high somersaults on the float. All in all, it was one of the most beautiful and extraordinary exhibitions I have ever seen. The Fiskultura movement began during the Civil War, May 25th, 1919. The first parade was organized by Vsevolok, the Universal Military Training Organization preparing raw recruits for the Red Army. From the beginning, physical culture meant military readiness. By 1931, this became official with the GTO program, ready for labor and defense. Millions of citizens were tested to meet physical standards. How many pull-ups could you do? How fast could you run a kilometer? Your GTO badge proved you were ready to defend socialism. Yet, alongside the state's demand for military preparedness, a parallel movement was happening inside people's homes and minds. It was a widespread popular aspiration to become cultured or kulturny. A clean, disciplined, healthy body was seen as the very foundation of the modern Soviet person, a clear break from a backward past. This project of kulturnost started with the basics: washing with soap, cleaning your teeth, not spitting on the floor. For the new elite, physical self-care was a requirement of their status. The industrial leader Orjonikidze instructed his managers to shave regularly. A model manager began every day with gymnastics at 6:15. Soviet sport positioned itself against Western athletics. The Olympics celebrated individual achievement, breaking records, personal glory. The Soviets promoted mass collective expression. Instead of sending athletes to the Amsterdam Olympics in 1928, they held the Spartakiad, named after the rebel slave. It was a festival of international proletarian solidarity through synchronized movement. This collective energy spilled out from the stadiums and into everyday life with a genuine, popular enthusiasm. Parachute jumping became a national craze, an activity that turned up everywhere. It was not just a military pursuit. The state set up recreational parachute jumping towers in parks of culture and rest for ordinary citizens to use. The sport symbolized Soviet daring and a new mastery of the air. The popularity of football soared in the 1930s, supported by new stadiums and generous state funding. The entire movement seemed to have a soundtrack in the famous Sportsman's March, with its celebratory, roaring lyric, "Fiskult ura ura ura." Artists created a new pantheon of athletic heroes. Alexander Samokvalov painted Girl Wearing a Football Jersey in 1932. She became the icon of the new Soviet woman. Strong shoulders, a confident gaze, ready for work or sport or war. These modern icons celebrated the Fiskulturnitsa, whose very image, replacing the saints of yesteryear, was designed to inspire devotion. You would see her everywhere, in Matvey Manizer's sculptures in the Moscow metro, on propaganda posters in every factory, Vera Mukina's massive worker and kolkhoz woman statue at the Paris World Fair, their bodies perfect, powerful, invincible. The paradox was timing. The celebration of perfect bodies peaked during the Great Terror. While those beautiful youth performed on Red Square in July 1937, the NKVD was conducting mass arrests across Moscow. The same year, Stalin had a football match staged on Red Square for his personal entertainment. They covered the square with green carpet. Dynamo Moscow, the NKVD team, played Spartak Moscow. Everyone involved in organizing it would later disappear. Alexander Kosarev, head of the Komsomol who initiated the game, shot. Nikolai Starostin, Spartak's trainer, sent to the Gulag. The generation trained in Fiskultura parades, those tanned and perfect youth Davies admired, would soon face the German invasion. Their athletic bodies would freeze in the trenches outside Moscow. They would starve during the siege of Leningrad. They would burn in tanks at Kursk. The physical culture that was supposed to create invincible defenders created young people who died by the millions, their gymnastics training no protection against artillery shells. Yet the movement did transform Soviet society. It changed how people thought about their bodies. Exercise became moral duty. Health became political responsibility. Millions moved in unison to the morning calisthenics on the radio. Factory workers took gymnastics breaks. Swimming pools were built, even in Siberian cities. Parks filled with pull-up bars where young men gathered after work. The body became another space where the state and the individual met, negotiated, and struggled. It was a site of genuine aspiration and pride, but also of ultimate service. The Komsomol oath was clear. I am prepared to give up my life if my nation should need it. As people insisted decades later, these weren't just words. Chapter 10. The Scent of an Empire. 2:0. For generations, Krasnaya Moskva was the scent of Soviet celebration. Red Moscow. The perfume came in a crystal flask, packed in a bright red box. You'd smell it at the theater, at weddings, on International Women's Day. In a world where luxury barely existed, this fragrance meant something special was happening. The story begins in 1913. The Moscow firm Brocard Company created a perfume called the Empress's Favorite Bouquet to celebrate 300 years of the Romanov dynasty. After the revolution, this single formula split into two legends. Ernest Beau, who'd worked for the competing firm A. Rallet Company, escaped to Paris with the formula. He presented variations to Coco Chanel. She chose the fifth one. Chanel number 5 was born. Meanwhile, Auguste Michel, a French perfumer at Brocard, couldn't leave Russia. His passport had gone missing in the revolutionary bureaucracy. The Brocard factory was nationalized, renamed Novaya Zarya, New Dawn. In 1925, Michel adapted the Empress's favorite bouquet for Soviet production. The new perfume launched in 1927 for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution. They called it Krasnaya Moskva. The same Tsarist formula now served two worlds: capitalist luxury in Paris, socialist prestige in Moscow. Initially, the Soviet state condemned perfume as bourgeois decadence. A 1924 article in Rabotnitsa, the working woman magazine, declared that cosmetics will be liquidated by raising the cultural level of women in the Kommunalka. Wearing perfume was an act of provocation. The constant mixing of great fragrances with the smell of cabbage soup or roast onions does not simply degrade a scent and turn it into something disagreeable and intrusive. It falsifies the very meaning of perfume as a concept. The secret pleasure a woman takes in her perfume became fragile and was swiftly terminated once she found herself criticized as petty bourgeois or oppressed by the grinding hardships of daily life. By the mid-30s, everything changed. The new Stalinist elite wanted their own version of the good life. Polina Shemchuzhina, wife of Foreign Minister Molotov, ran the Teje Cosmetics Trust. She promoted Soviet perfume production as politically necessary. Kulturnost meant smelling good. The state that had condemned perfume now manufactured it by the ton. Krasnaya Moskva became the scent of the nomenklatura. Film stars like Lyubov Orlova wore it. The perfume counter at the Hotel Moskva's department store sold it to party officials' wives. The perfumer Rudolf Friedman described its character in 1955, associated with elegant warmth, playful and flirtatious languor, melodious, plastic harmony. Another analysis found it had an astounding combination of rigor and sexuality, tenderness and firmness. Over 60 ingredients, creating something complex, contradictory, perfectly Soviet. After the war, Soviet perfume production expanded. By the 60s, Krasnaya Moskva seemed old-fashioned. Young people wanted fragrances from Poland or East Germany. When perestroika arrived, Western brands flooded in. Dior, Gucci, Chanel itself. The factory that produced Krasnaya Moskva was privatized, struggled, nearly disappeared. Today, you can still buy Krasnaya Moskva, though the formula has changed. The factory claims it's the same, but perfumers say the expensive ingredients were replaced long ago. The crystal bottle became glass. The red box became cardboard. What remains is the memory of that scent. Women in their 80s still recognize it immediately. It takes them back to their youth, to dancing at the Palace of Culture, to their first kiss in Gorky Park, the perfume that was born from empire, survived revolution, and defined an era now sits on dusty shelves in Moscow gift shops. Tourists buy it as a curiosity. The scent of an empire that tried to make everything new, but couldn't escape the fact that even its fragrances had aristocratic bloodlines. Some escapes from the past were more brutal than others. Chapter 11. The Tyranny of the Cold. Kolyma stretches across the Siberian Far East, larger than Western Europe. They called it the Pole of Cold. During the first 5-year plans, the Soviet state operated under immense pressure to industrialize at an impossible speed, viewing it as a matter of national survival. To finance this, the Dalstroy Trust was established to exploit Kolyma's vast resources of gold and uranium, using the labor of the Gulag system to meet its quotas. In this brutal equation of resource extraction against the clock, human lives were subordinated to industrial targets. Yevgenia Ginsburg spent years in Kolyma. She wrote about the thermometer hanging outside the guard hut. -49 °C was the worst possible reading of all, because the official humanity of the medical regulations could come into operation only when the thermometer read -50 °. -50 ° meant that the administration could cancel work in the forest that day. 1 degree separated a day of brutal labor from staying in the ice-encrusted barracks. Every morning began with prisoners staring at that thermometer, hoping for that single degree of mercy. Varlam Shalamov knew the cold intimately. He didn't need a thermometer. If there was a frosty mist, then it was -40 centigrade outside. If there was a noise when you breathed out, but you could still breathe normally, then it was -45. If your breath was noisy and you were out of breath, then it was -50. Below 55 degrees, a gob of spit freezes, solid in mid-air. Spit had been freezing in mid-air for 2 weeks. The cold shaped everything. Shalamov wrote that the same cold that turned saliva to ice in mid-air had gotten to the human soul. You couldn't think about anything in the freezing cold. Everything was simple. A cold, hungry brain couldn't take in nutrition. The brain cells withered. That was what happened to the soul. It froze, it shrank, and, maybe, it would stay cold forever. The official ideology of the camps was perikovka, reforging. This was the belief that corrective labor could transform criminals and political opponents into productive Soviet citizens. However, in the extreme conditions of Kolyma, where production quotas consistently overrode concerns for human welfare, this ideological purpose disintegrated. The reality for most was not reforging, but a desperate battle against starvation and the elements. Shalamov worked as a medical orderly, documenting the stages of this decline: scurvy, pellagra, and alimentary dystrophy. The final stage they called dokodyaga, goner. Shalamov calculated the mathematics of destruction. To turn a healthy young man, who had begun his career in the clean winter air of the gold mines, into a goner, all that was needed, at a conservative estimate, was a term of 20 to 30 days of 16 hours of work per day, with no rest days, with systematic starvation, torn clothes, and nights spent in temperatures of minus 60 degrees in a canvas tent with holes in it, and being beaten by the foreman. The gold mines consumed work brigades completely. They'd be replaced several times in a single season. The dead weren't buried in the permafrost, too hard to dig, bodies piled up, waiting for spring when meltwater would wash them away. Shalamov wrote that a gold mine constantly discards its production refuse into the hospitals, the so-called convalescent teams, invalid settlements, and mass graves. For Shalamov, the body itself became testimony. He wrote about researching his material with his own hide, not only with his heart, but with every pore of his skin, his every nerve. His Kolyma glove was his worker's hand, permanently bent into the shape of a shovel handle. Frostbite, scars, skin that peeled from scurvy became what he called a living exhibit for the Museum of Local History. The gold extracted from the permafrost at such a high human cost entered the arteries of the Soviet economy. It paid for imported factory equipment and funded monumental projects like the Dnieper Dam and the Moscow Metro, symbols of a new industrial future. Kolyma thus represents a central paradox of the era, the construction of a modern state through the simultaneous destruction of its own people. While Moscow celebrated industrial triumphs, the permafrost preserved the evidence of their cost, holding its victims in the same cold that killed them. Chapter 12. The Paradox of Soviet Ballet. Russian ballet survived everything: revolution, civil war, terror, world war. Before 1917, it led Europe. Marius Petipa choreographing in St. Petersburg, Anna Pavlova and Vaslav Nijinsky dancing on the world's stages. After the revolution, many fled west. Serge Diaghilev's ballets, Russia's, became the center of modernism in Paris, uniting Stravinsky's music, Picasso's designs, Bakst's costumes. Yet the Bolshoi in Moscow and the Kirov in Leningrad endured, state-supported, meticulously preserved. They became the Soviet Union's premier cultural export. From this world came Rudolf Nureyev. His refusal to board a Moscow-bound flight at Le Bourget Airport on April 17, 1962, became a Cold War sensation. He launched into fame, 300 performances a year from London to Tokyo, open about his homosexuality, extravagant in his lifestyle, rebellious in his behavior. Critics called him the heir to Nijinsky. They praised his magical agility, his wild leaps, his fierce discipline. At the end of every performance, he'd bow with hand outstretched, a gesture of what seemed like natural grace. That grace was forged in the Kirov school through years of almost mathematical training. The Vaganova choreographic school shaped Nureyev. Vera Kostrovitskaya's textbook, School of Classical Dance, reveals the science behind Soviet ballet. Every movement dissected, codified, grounded in anatomical logic. She explains Aplomb, perfect stability. The basis of stability lies in the preservation of the vertical axis, which passes through the middle of the head and body to the ball of the supporting foot. To obtain stability in those cases where a bend of the body to the side or back or an inclination forward is required, the center weight must be over the supporting leg, through which passes the vertical axis of the body. This rigorous method demanded total physical and mental discipline. The body became a perfectly calibrated instrument. Nuriev's path was unlikely. Born in 1938 on a trans-Siberian train to a Tatar Bashkir family, grew up in provincial Ufa, a local teacher who'd trained in Imperial Street. Petersburg noticed his talent. At 17, late for a ballet student, he entered the Kirov School, founded in 1738, steeped in 2 centuries of tradition. Leningrad itself was his education, the city of palaces and museums, where the intelligentsia had survived revolution and siege, preserving their reverence for high culture. His teacher, Alexander Pushkin, carried the direct lineage of classical tradition. Joseph Brodsky described this milieu, this world that gave Nuriev what his biographers called his stature, his power, and his self-confidence. The tradition survived because of Agrippina Vaganova, born 1879, graduated from the Imperial Ballet School. When others fled after the revolution, she stayed and taught. She produced the first generation of great Soviet ballerinas, including Galina Ulanova. Vaganova dismissed the avant-garde experiments of the 20s as destructive aberration. When Stalin's cultural policy shifted toward classical forms in the 30s, her approach triumphed. Appointed artistic director of the Kirov in 1931, she made it her mission to preserve and revive ballets of classical heritage. Her textbook became Soviet ballet's Bible. The Kirov became increasingly conservative. By the late 50s, when the thaw exposed Soviet artists to Western influences, the theater felt like a museum. Nuriev hungered for modern choreographers like George Balanchine, who were evolving the art form. The Kirov's restrictive repertoire and constant surveillance by officials made him feel trapped. His defection was artistic necessity. He needed to engage with ballet's future, to prove that true grace couldn't be confined by borders. Maya Plisetskaya, another great Soviet dancer, lost her father to Stalin's terror in the same sweet Stalinist manner. The ballet world had its victims during the purges, yet it remained a protected space of artistic excellence. The state that destroyed so many artists also preserved this one tradition with obsessive care. The dancers, trained to leap and spin with perfect control, lived in a country where every other movement was watched and regulated. The contradiction was breathtaking. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Empire. The Lenin Mausoleum sits on Red Square like a geometric fact. Red granite and black labradorite arranged in ascending blocks. For 70 years, this cube was the absolute center of Soviet power. Every parade, every celebration, every mass demonstration oriented itself around this structure. The leaders stood on its tribune, The people filed through its doors. Lenin lay inside, eternal. On holidays, May 1st, November 7th, Victory Day on May 9th, the Politburo would climb the stairs to the tribune. From that platform, they watched hundreds of thousands march past, workers carrying paper flowers, athletes forming living pictures, tanks rumbling over cobblestones, shaking the ground, children on their fathers' shoulders, waving at the distant figures above. The mausoleum organized all this energy into a single ritual. The individual dissolved into the mass. The mass confirmed its bond with power. On ordinary days, the queue formed before dawn. It snaked across Red Square in January blizzards and August heat. More than 70 million people made this pilgrimage over 70 years. The wait could last hours. The line moved slowly past the Kremlin walls, past the changing of the guard at the Spassky Gate. Finally, you descended, from daylight into cool dimness. Guards stood motionless, no talking aloud, no photographs. Down polished granite stairs into the funeral chamber. There, in a crystal sarcophagus designed by Konstantin Melnikov, lay Lenin. Reddish light illuminated his face and hands. Visitors filed past in continuous motion, forbidden to stop. The encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then back up the stairs, out into daylight, the spell broken. Leonid Krasin, who helped organize the preservation, proclaimed in 1924 that Moscow would become the new Mecca, the mausoleum, its holiest shrine. The architect Alexei Shushev was summoned in the middle of the night after Lenin died in January 1924. He later described the frantic construction. At minus 25 degrees, the earth was too hard for shovels and crowbars to make an impression. Explosives experts were needed. The construction workers were able to keep warm by sleeping in special military tents outfitted with stoves. The entire labor of building the mausoleum lasted another 3 days. The workmen only left Red Square at the moment when the military arrived to take part in the solemnities. That first wooden structure was meant to be temporary, but the endless queue of mourners convinced the leadership. Otherwise, a permanent tomb required permanent preservation. A secret laboratory was established, the Pedagogic Center for Biomedical Technologies. Hundreds of scientists worked on maintaining Lenin's body. They developed new formulas, new techniques. Every 18 months, the body was removed, re-embalmed, the skin treated with chemicals that kept it supple and lifelike. This was modern science conquering death. The Bolsheviks had mocked the Orthodox Church for venerating saints' relics. Now they had their own incorruptible body, preserved through chemistry rather than miracle. The historian Ernst Kantorowicz wrote about the king's two bodies, the mortal flesh and the eternal symbol. Lenin's preserved corpse guaranteed the continuity of the state he founded. Stalin joined him there from 1953 to 1961. Then one night, during de-Stalinization, Stalin's body was quietly removed and buried by the Kremlin wall. Lenin remained alone. After 1991, proposals emerged to finally bury him, as his family had wanted. But something held the country back. The mausoleum had become inseparable from Red Square itself. Today the queue is gone. Sometimes during celebrations, they board up the mausoleum, hiding it behind plywood. Rock concerts happen on the square. Luxury stores line Goom department store, where people once queued for basic goods. The red cube remains neither fully honored nor abandoned. The scientists still maintain Lenin's body, though the state that created him has vanished. Every few years, someone proposes moving him. Every few years, nothing happens. He lies there still, in his crystal case, in his geometric tomb, while above him the new Russia tries to decide what to do with its most perfectly preserved relic.